She's going to Florida Saturday to Key West. Everybody is. So,
My name, for those of you who do not know me, is Lena Simone. I have been a parent for the last 13 years. I have a 7th grader, and I also have a 3rd grader currently in public school. And while I'm an active board member on both the middle school and hood school parent associations, my main title, so to speak, is that of concerned parent, much like many of you in attendance tonight. It may not be the most glamorous title, but I think it's one of the most important. I'm here because I believe that Common Core and PARCC are not the best we can do for our children or our teachers. Having lived in North Reading for the past 14 years, I can tell you that I feel very fortunate to be raising my children in such a caring community. We truly have some of the best teachers around, honestly. My kids will come home from school the first day and say, "Oh, Mom, I have the best teacher. This is the best teacher I've ever had." And then inevitably, the next year comes and I hear the exact same thing. "Oh, this is the best teacher." So we really feel lucky. And that's why I joined the organization that's sponsoring this event, Common Core Forum. CommonCoreForum.org is a nonpartisan statewide organization formed within the last year. It was founded by a former Worcester School Committee member, Donna Colorio, sitting right there on the end. Our mission is to get the word out regarding issues with Common Core, one of the largest changes to the public education system in our nation's history, as well as PARCC, the test that goes along with it. Our members include former and current school committee members, educators, parents, and activists across the political spectrum. We have organized several forums in Massachusetts over the past year and will continue to do more. As parents, we need to educate not only ourselves about the many issues surrounding Common Core and PARCC, but we also have a responsibility to educate others in our communities. Here in Massachusetts, we have a critical issue upon us, how to proceed with PARCC. Massachusetts will be making a decision later this year as to whether we choose PARCC, or stay with MCAS, albeit perhaps an updated version. North Reading chose to utilize the PARCC pilot this year, but close to half of the communities, 54% to 46%, chose to stay with MCAS until a decision is made. Now, school spending is approximately 2/3 of all localities' budgets, so even if you don't have children currently in school, this is a major issue. And in my eyes, what is more important than our children? Now, I'd like to get right to our speakers. Our first speaker is Mr. Jamie Gass. Jamie is the Pioneer Institute's Director of the Center for School Reform. At Pioneer, Jamie has framed, commissioned, and managed over 60 research papers and numerous policy events on K-12 education reform topics. Jamie has more than 2 decades of experience in public administration and education reform at the state, municipal, and school district levels. Please welcome Mr. Jamie Gass.
first of all, I want to thank you folks for coming out on a cold winter night and to listen to what I think is an important topic that has an enormous impact on the lives of our school children in the state, but I think will also have a big impact on the lives of school children all across the country. And so therefore I'm really grateful both to Common Core Forum and moms who have set up events like this, not just in Massachusetts, but they've done it really across the country over the last 4 or 5 years, but in earnest here in Massachusetts in the last year or so, where we've had well over 40 or so of them. So to begin, I'm just going to give you some of the basics of what Common Core is, because even though 40 some odd states have adopted Common Core almost 4 years ago, the reality of it is that a great number of state legislators, not only in Massachusetts, but across the country, and an enormous number of parents really have no idea what Common Core is. So Common Core is a set of national English and math standards. That is an outline or a framework of what it is that should be taught in your classrooms, in schools locally. It was developed by the National Governors Association, which represents the governors of each state. They don't represent the states, but they represent the governors of each state. And then the Council of Chief State School Officers, which represent the state education commissioners of each state. These two trade organizations are located in Washington, D.C. They are not accountable to the public. They do receive some public dollars through membership dues that the governors and the commissioners of education pay to them, but they're not accountable to the public. They are very much private lobby groups in Washington, D.C. Most of the funding that came for the development of Common Core came from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You all know who Bill Gates is. He is the former CEO of Microsoft. They've spent about $200 million not only paying for the development of the standards themselves, but also giving funding to a variety of these kinds of trade organizations around education, whether it's the state boards of education or whether it is the teachers unions or et cetera. All the sort of the lobby groups or special interest groups around education have received, in many instances, tens of millions of dollars to advocate for Common Core. And Common Core will also be matched with a set of national tests. So for Massachusetts, that means the PARCC test. In our neighbors to the north in New Hampshire and Maine, they're in what they call the Smarter Balance Testing Consortia. And those are two federally funded testing consortia. They're funded directly by the U.S. Department of Education, and there's some problems with that I'll get into a little bit later. So to give you some context, I'm going to start off with a quote from someone who knows and knew, frankly, a great deal more about Constitution and the Bill of Rights and governance in this country than I certainly do, or anyone else around this entire conversation, and that's James Madison. He was called the father of the Constitution, and he was the author of the Bill of Rights. And he wrote this in 1792. If Congress may establish teachers in every state, county, and parish, and pay them out of the public treasury, they may take into their own hands the education of children, establishing in like manner schools throughout the Union. I would venture to declare it as my opinion, it would subvert the very foundation and transmute the very nature of the limited government established by the people of America. And this is from James Madison. And with that, I want to give you some of the context. I think that the Founding Fathers were incredibly far-sighted, drawing from lessons throughout history about the importance of limits on the central authority. So our national government does foreign policy and trade and defense and commerce, but all of the issues that most directly and intimately connect the lives of citizens, particularly school children, are the proper legal and financial jurisdiction of states. So for the last 50 years or so, we've seen a steady growth in the role of the federal government in K-12 education. It's also kind of coincided with a lot of educational decline, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But the fact is that 90% of the funding for K-12 education in this country comes from the state and local governments, right? The US Constitution is virtually silent on K-12 education, whereas the Massachusetts Constitution, which was written in 1780 by John Adams, and it's the oldest written constitution in the world, is very specific and detailed about the obligations of state legislators to not only support it financially, but to advocate and promote literature, mathematics, science, etc. So again, very little in the federal constitution about it, if anything at all, and then the state constitutions are very, very detailed and specific. And I would argue that this arrangement of the federal government doing what it can do well, focusing on national issues and foreign policy and trade, and the states focusing on the things that most intimately connect the lives of citizens, has actually worked pretty well. They call this arrangement federalism, right? And it's a balance of power. It's a fundamental feature of our Constitution. And it's worked well. It's basically taken this country from a loose collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard in a little over 200 years, made us the most powerful country in the world. The country that helped defeat fascism, the country that helped and defeat communism, the country that was able to put a man on the moon, right? These are no small accomplishments, right? And what's unique about this country is that unlike a lot of the countries in Europe or all over the world, is that the ideas come from the citizens. They come locally. Commentators throughout the decades and centuries have observed that what's unique about the United States is that it's not like Europe where there's kings and queens and monarchs and czars and ministers that make all these decisions for us, but that the uniqueness of this country is that the ideas for government and governance come from citizens. And this is what the founders envisioned. They envisioned schools being a wellspring of our republic. That was their vision, that they wanted schools that could give children the general background knowledge so that they could be active citizens and participants in our society, understanding the necessity to vote and the laws, right? But the reality of it is that I think we all know this somewhere in our guts, that we began to lose our way, particularly in education, sometime a little after World War II. In 1957, there was an example of this. It was called Sputnik. The Soviet Union launched into orbit the first satellite. And people began to recognize that we were losing our edge, particularly in the area of math and science, but we were falling behind our ability to compete with, at that time, the Soviet Union in the space race and the arms race, okay? And right up through until 1983, there was a report authored by the U.S. Department of Education under Ronald Reagan. It was called A Nation at Risk. It was a big landmark report. And what this report said was, and mapped out in a lot of detail, is that we had in fact lost our edge. We had gone from among the highest performing countries in the world and had fallen to about 11th or 17th in the world in the area of mathematics and science and other areas of international competitiveness. Specifically, this Nation at Risk report said, if we had our system of education imposed on us by a foreign enemy, it would be an act of war. And that there was a complacency and decline that was beginning to settle in that needed to be remedied. What that report did not do was come up with lots of top-down solutions from Washington, D.C. on how to fix it. Because whether they're Republicans or Democrats or conservatives or liberals, everybody understood that there were limits on what the federal government could do in terms of K-12 education. Everybody, even today in this debate, they understand that K-12 education is the proper legal jurisdiction of states, okay? Here in Massachusetts, we're really quite fortunate, and this helps give us the context of how we got to where we are with this debate on Common Core. In 1993, we were really fortunate because while the rest of the country was continuing to be stuck in stagnation and decline, and people in Washington, D.C. were talking about national standards and testing and national curriculum, and people were on the other side of the spectrum were talking about greater school choice and competition into the process to help improve schools. We were really lucky and completely unique, really, in the last 20 years. Because we had three people that shaped and directed this state into a dramatically different path. And those were a guy named Tom Birmingham, who later became Senate President. He's a Democrat with very close relationships with organized labor. Mark Roosevelt, who was the great-grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, also a Democrat with great relationships with organized labor. And Bill Weld, who was Republican governor at the time. And what these three lawmakers and executives did was they sat down and crafted the landmark 1993 Education Reform Act. And what they did was they made a deal. It was a grand bargain of a great deal of additional resources, and we've spent well over $100 billion in the last 20 years on K-12 education at the state and local level, in exchange for all of the difficult things that people had not really wanted to do in the previous decades, not just in Massachusetts, but across the country. That is to say, we weren't going to do fuzzy math, we weren't going to do self-esteem, hands-on learning, we weren't going to do all the educational fads that had kind of migrated the country and education away from its real mission and purpose, which is academics, right? You're being fortunate enough to hear later from Sandy Stotsky, who was the architect of the standards that were the basis for those reforms in the 1990s. So, we're going to have an MCAS test as a high-stakes graduation requirement. You all know of this. And it was going to be connected to English, math, science, and history standards. Again, back to the basics. Specifically, in English, we were going to be studying English, right? Literature, poetry, drama, all these higher quality, better vocabulary texts that require kids to read through the lines and really analyze things. It also has the benefit of teaching kids about citizenship. It has about drama, about tragedy, about love, about friendship. Literature teaches us about the things that bind us together as human beings. Because as a man, a couple years ago, wrote a book called The Storytelling Animal, human beings are the storytelling animal. Whether you're in a courtroom, or whether you're a politician, or whether you're in business, often the people that tell the best story, they usually succeed, right? But it's these stories going back to antiquity that bind us together as human beings. It defines us of what we are as human beings, right? And those were embedded in the standards that Dr. Stotsky developed, okay? On the mathematics side, we learned all the best lessons from California and South Korea and Hong Kong and Singapore, all the high standard, high performing states and countries. And the big lesson, and 15,000 pieces of research make this clear since then, is that you have to have access to Algebra 1 in the 8th grade. Because if you have access to Algebra 1 in the 8th grade, then kids can get on a trajectory where they can take higher level mathematics by the time they graduate from high school, so that they're able to enter college prepared to be in the STEM fields, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, right? So that was the basis, right? So this was ed reform. The money, MCAS, high academic standards, teacher testing. Teachers are going to be held to the same high level of expectations on academic material as the students, right? We added some charter schools in there to inject some choice and competition into the equation. So this configuration, this law in 1993, really has turned out to be a historic accomplishment. Because while the rest of the country has continued to be stuck in stagnation and decline, Massachusetts' performance has gone to the roof. Specifically, there's a test called the NAEP test. It's the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It is the nation's report card. It has been around for about 30 or 40 years. Every state takes it. They take it every couple of years, right? No state in the history of that test has been number one in every grade tested and every category tested. And in 2005, really only a few years after the standards and the testing were put into place, guess what state in the union was number one in every category tested and every grade tested? Massachusetts, right? And then we did it again in 2007, 2009, 2011, 2013. No state has done it once. We've done it 5 times in a row. I say that it's like winning the World Series 5 times in a row and doing it in 4 straight games every single time. It's a remarkable, remarkable accomplishment. The teachers, the principals, the taxpayers, the lawmakers, the policymakers that made this happen have given us a gift that the rest of the country doesn't enjoy. And it really has made us the marvel of the rest of the country. But as I mentioned in that Nation at Risk report in 1983, the goal for the 21st century is not just competing with Arkansas or Mississippi or Louisiana. It's competing with Hong Kong and Singapore, and South Korea and Japan. You got to compete with the high-performing, largely East Asian countries in order to compete in the 21st century, particularly in the area of mathematics. So in 2007, Massachusetts was one of only 2 states in the Union that tested as its own individual country on a test called the TIMSS test, which is the gold standard of international math and science tests. Guess what? Massachusetts was at the top or near the top in math and science, 4th and 8th graders, compared with the best countries in the world. Specifically, 8th graders tied for #1 in the world in science, right? A remarkable, remarkable accomplishment, right? If winning being #1 on the NAEP test is like winning World Series, this is like winning Olympic gold medals. And guess what? We did it again in 2013. So in 2009, when the US Department of Education, the Obama administration, was talking about a federal grant program for $4.3 billion to have states sign on to compete for that money, it wasn't the race to the top. It was the race to become Massachusetts. And they had to have Massachusetts as the trophy that they put on that mantelpiece so that all the other states would fall into line. So Pioneer Institute, where I work, is an independent, nonpartisan think tank. We've been around for about 20 years or so. Our former executive director was the chair of the Board of Ed when ed reform was being pushed in the mid to late 90s, and is the current Secretary of Education in the Baker administration. And we're pretty much known for calling it like we see it. We are independent. We have 3/4 or 80% of our funding comes from independent donors. There's no deep-pocketed foundation that's paying us for our opinions on this topic. So in 2010, when Common Core began to come down through the Governor's Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, we said, someone better take a look at these standards. We got the most to lose. So we enlisted Dr. Stotsky, who had worked on the standards in not only in Massachusetts, but in a variety of other states. Even the Common Core advocates will tell you. That lady over there sitting in the center of the table, or the center of chairs, she has credibility on this topic that nobody else in the country has. And that's just a fact. Right? In fact, the advocates of Common Core, prior to Common Core, used to rely on her for her judgments on grading the standards all over the country. We coupled Sandy with a guy named Jim Milgram, internationally renowned professor of mathematics at Stanford University. What's unique about Professor Milgram is that not only is he an accomplished mathematician in his own right, but he's actually one of the few mathematicians that cares about K-12 education standards too. And he was the architect of the very high quality California math standards. So we got Sandy, we got Milgram, and then we got a guy named Zev Werman, who was a Silicon Valley engineer and a businessman who had also worked on the California math standards. And what we asked them to do, and they did this in 4 consecutive crosswalks of every draft of Common Core, we said, what's your scholarly opinion of the quality of Common Core against high standard states like Massachusetts, Indiana, Minnesota, Texas, California? And what these experts found is that at every step of the way, Common Core was of lower academic quality in both English and mathematics than high standard states. So for Massachusetts, Common Core was not going to be a race to the top. It was going to be a race to the middle. That was very clear, and it was cleared out back in 2010, even in the face of the State Board of Education adopting Common Core in the summer of 2010, when all of you were at the beach or relaxing and having a barbecue. That's when they decided it was a good idea to turn their back on the 20-year commitment that this state had made under ed reform, the higher academic standards and expectations. Specifically, Common Core cut the classic literature and poetry and drama that I talked about earlier as being really the secret sauce for our historic successes in reading, right? So you're going to look in vain in Common Core for Huckleberry Finn, for Sherlock Holmes, for Dickens, these higher quality pieces of literature that matter really so much to the intellectual development of kids, but also to their spiritual development, if you will, right? They also ignored the Common Core authors, also ignored the evidence from Massachusetts and California and high standards countries, and decided to cut the commitment to Algebra 1 at the 8th grade. They said, well, we're going to just move it forward a grade or 2, so it'll be late 9th or early 10th grade. So the fact is that under Common Core, not only students in Massachusetts, but kids across the country are going to be about 2 years behind their international competitors in the area of mathematics. They also, the Common Core writers, inserted an experimental form of geometry that had never been successful in any place it's been tried. And they really top out at what they call Algebra 2 Light, which is really a mathematical path to nowhere if your child is interested in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, right? A remarkable lack of attentiveness to facts, data, research, and evidence, and the performance of this state and all the high-performing states and countries. The next piece of research we looked at was the legality, because as I mentioned at the beginning, the fact is that people across the spectrum have known that there are federal laws that prohibit the federal government from providing incentives or encouraging states to adopt national standards, testing, and curriculum. So we had the former general counsel and deputy general counsel in the U.S. Department of Education under the second Bush administration, the two highest ranking lawyers in the federal government, look at the laws. And it turns out there are 3 federal laws that explicitly and clearly says that the U.S. Department of Education and the federal government cannot provide incentives and can't encourage states to do national standards in testing and curriculum. Specifically, those laws are the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, signed by Lyndon Johnson, the General Education Provision Act of 1970, signed by Richard Nixon, and the enabling legislation that set up the U.S. Department of Education itself in 1979, which was signed by Jimmy Carter. I think it's important to note that even though the advocates of Common Core say, oh, people that are opposed to Common Core, they're right-leaning, or they're Tea Party, or they're Republicans, 2 of the 3 laws that prohibit the feds from doing what it is that they're doing under Common Core and funding the PARCC testing were signed by Democrats, right? Jimmy Carter and Lyndon Johnson, okay? But don't take my opinion for it. There's a couple of articles over there, and columns written by George Will, who over the last 30 years is one of the best respected commentators and columnists in this country. And what he does is cite our research on the legality and says exactly what we have said. That the federal government in the U.S. Department of Education is essentially pretending that there aren't laws that prevent them from doing what they're doing. Okay? The next piece of research we decided to take a look at was the cost. Because even though there's been $200 million pumped into the development and advocacy, 95 or higher % of the governors, legislators, state budget office, boards of ed, departments of ed have not done a cost projection on what it's going to cost to implement Common Core. So we thought someone ought to take a look at it. And what we came up with, we got independent researchers who had worked for both Republicans and Democrats in Capitol Hill. And they came up with a figure of about $16 billion. That's what's going to cost the states and localities to implement the Common Core. So all new textbooks, all new teacher professional development, enormous technology costs related to, and you probably have seen this already, using iPads and things like that for the testing, right? Those are the big cost drivers. The other side essentially has not done a cost projection. After ours came out, some of the folks that are Common Core advocates did a cost projection, and to their embarrassment, they ignored the biggest cost driver, which is the multi-year technology costs, which are being baked into not only school department budgets, but municipal budgets all over the country, right? There's the sort of the final piece of research we've looked at is the data collection. Because the truth of it is that while the Common Core is focused on the standards and the testing, there's running parallel to this is the federal government's desire to collect lots of personal identifiable data on your children. I say that as the husband or the father of a 3-year-old daughter and a 7-year-old daughter. We did a report called Cogs in the Machine, written by a woman named Jane Robbins. If you Google Jane Robbins data collection, she's a Harvard Law School attorney. She's, can do on YouTube. She has videos that explain this in a lot more detail than I can tonight. But suffice to say, they want to basically collect 400 pieces of data on your children. And the fact is that the federal government, there are federal laws, FERPA laws, they're called the privacy laws, that prevent them from doing this. They're just brushing those aside. And they're really basically have created incentives for the states to collect the data, and then the data is then turned over to the feds. They're also, through things like PARCC, are ensuring that whatever data is collected through these testing consortia are also turned over to the feds. There's a lot more issues that I could talk about. I'm going to just summarize by saying I've mapped out a lot of details and a lot of specifics, and some of it's very discouraging. The good news of it is that there's things like the Common Core Forum. The good news is that there are moms all over this country that have gotten themselves extraordinarily well educated and well organized on this topic. And states are beginning to peel it back. States that had a lot less to lose than we did. States like Oklahoma, which is an average performing state, they had pretty good standards. They had nowhere near the performance or standards we did. They have repealed it. They're trying to figure out how they're going to move forward. States like Texas from the beginning said, don't mess with Texas. We're going to use it as an opportunity to elevate our standards. They didn't do Common Core. They got Dr. Stotsky to do the English standards. They got Professor Milgram to do their math standards. And they are as good or better than what Massachusetts used to have. For my money, Texas now has the highest academic standards in the country. And they told the feds, we're not doing it, right? Indiana, North Carolina, South Carolina, there's a lot of other states that are in fits and starts of either repealing or trying to peel back all of the red tape and all of the regulations that the feds are trying to dump on states regarding this. So there is cause for optimism. I'm not saying it's not a significant fight, but Massachusetts has not adopted the PARCC test. Governor Baker, when he ran in 2010, was opposed to Common Core. In 2014, when he ran, he was a little more ambiguous. We're hopeful that if parents bring pressure to bear, not only to the governor, but also the legislature and the Board of Ed, that we can prevent them from adopting the PARCC testing, which then gets us into a conversation where we might be able to go back to the previous proven high-quality standards. But this is a fight, and I'm not going to deceive you. It is very difficult. It is difficult work, and you've got to get yourself educated on it. I think events like this are a first excellent step. And I'll just conclude by, I started off with a quote from a founding father, so I'm going to end with a quote from a founding father. And this is from Alexander Hamilton, who is the first Secretary of the Treasury. He wrote most of the Federalist Papers, which was the essays in defense of adopting the Constitution. He wrote this in 1788 for the New York Convention for the adoption of the Constitution. While the Constitution continues to be read and its principles known, the states must, by every rational man, be considered as essential component parts of the Union. And therefore, the idea of sacrificing the former to the latter is wholly inadmissible. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Jamie. Before I turn it over to Dr. Stotsky, I want to talk about, very briefly, one thing that makes me, as a parent, extremely nervous. And that is, as Jamie talked about, the data collection. Because of recent changes to FERPA, which Jamie also mentioned, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, virtually anyone who can get access to your children's data without parental consent. The Department of Education also redefined without congressional approval a, quote, authorized representative to expand privacy exemptions that had previously protected student privacy under FERPA. These reinterpretations remove affirmative legal duties for state and local educational facilities to protect private student data. Before 2012, the language in FERPA was that only individuals under the direct control of the U.S. Education Secretary or state education representatives could access data without consent. Now, an authorized rep can be anyone, such as another government agency, a foundation, a nonprofit, an individual, a for-profit, a research group, etc. In short, pretty much anyone. As long as the data is released in connection with an audit or an evaluation of a federal or state-sponsored, quote, educational program, no parental consent is required. Just to give you a couple of examples of groups that the Department of Education has considered authorized reps, the Washington State Department of Public Institutes signed agreements to share personal student data with the Associated Press and with the Seattle Times, citing both of those as, quote, research organizations. Now, here are some of the personally identifiable data that they can share. Your children's names, their addresses, family members, dates and place of birth, student IDs, social security numbers, health records, disciplinary records, as well as biometric data, which is defined as, quote, one or more biological or behavioral characteristics that can be used for automated recognition of an individual. Examples include fingerprints, retina and iris patterns, voice prints, facial characteristics, and handwriting. Now, before you say, oh, she's just getting a little off the topic here, she's getting crazy, there are schools that are currently using children's thumbprints to pay for lunch. So this is coming down the pike, and it is something that we have to be concerned about. An article in the New York Times from September 14th of last year voiced these exact concerns, saying, quote, technology companies are collecting a vast amount of data about students, touching every corner of their educational lives with few controls about how those details are used. We all work so hard to protect our kids, yet schools are potentially one of the places where they may be becoming the most vulnerable. Now, our next speaker, we'll get right to her, is Dr. Sandra Stodsky. Dr. Stodsky is a retired professor of education reform from the University of Arkansas. She was the Senior Associate Commissioner of Education from 1999 to 2003 here in Massachusetts, and she's credited with developing one of the country's strongest sets of academic standards for K through 12 students, as well as the strongest academic standards in licensure tests for prospective teachers. Dr. Stodsky also served on the Common Core Validation Committee. Please welcome Dr. Sandra Stodsky.
Thank you very much. And could I just have a show of hands? How many of you have children or grandchildren in the schools, public schools? Most of you. How many of you might be elected or appointed public officials of some kind? 2 people, okay. And I don't know if they're teachers, administrators, a couple of hands, that's it, okay. So most of you have a very vested interest in what happens in the schools. What I'm going to do for about 20 minutes, and Donna is going to kick me when it's almost time for me to finish so that we can have a Q&A at a proper time for you. I'm going to divide my talk into about 4 different major topics. First of all, oh, I can hear the difference. If you can't hear, just wave your hand at the back, because it's very hard for me to just talk right into this, but in any event. First part is going to be about the philosophy I brought to bear while I was in the Department of Ed here in Massachusetts. Because if you have had children in the schools for a while, until about 2011, the schools were using the standards that were created in the early 2000s when I was in the department. So as teachers, administrators, or parents, you might have been able to get a sense of what it was your children were doing and studying in your major subjects in the schools compared with whatever has been taking place since 2011, which has been a gradual replacement in English, math, and to some extent in science by Common Core of whatever the old Massachusetts standards were. So the first point I will address will be the philosophy I brought to bear in doing these K-12 standards. The second, I will talk about the validation committee I was on because it is important conceptually and it helps to explain, both Professor Milgram and I think, some of the problems we are facing today with Common Core's standards. Third, I will speak very briefly to the flaws in the English language arts standards in Common Core, and I will also refer to a handout that Professor Milgram has vetted and prepared on the muddled, missing, or delayed standards in math. And both of those are available as handouts somewhere, so maybe they're on that table. They are freely available. You can pass them on to your math and high school science chairs if you want, ELA chairs, do whatever you want with them. We posted them in many places and they are free to be distributed anywhere. And then the last topic I will address briefly will be what I suggest parents might do in the face of some of the issues that I will be discussing. Let me begin first by talking about what I at least intended back in 1999 when I was hired by Commissioner David Driscoll, who was at that time the Commissioner of Education in Massachusetts. And I was certainly fortunate to have a Board of Ed that supported me, as well as a commissioner, so all the stars were aligned in my heaven. And I was given as my first task, and this is the important one, I was asked to completely revise our teacher licensing regulations and then the licensure tests. And then I was also asked to revise or develop our K-12 standards in major subjects. And I had to coordinate all of these together. And that, of course, was the name of the game, that all of these pieces had to be in some way integrated with each other. Why? Because if we were going to have first-class standards in English, math, science, and history and social studies, we needed teachers who were capable of teaching to stronger standards. And that is part of the big picture that has been missing from the national scene up until this very day. It's simply not a part of their way of thinking, but it was a part of my thinking ever since I had been a teacher many years ago, both in elementary and in high school. That's a long time ago, but I have had experience in the classroom. The philosophy I brought to bear was, first of all, that we needed to raise everybody's academic achievement in this state. We were about middle of the pack, and this country had been undergoing a decline in the quality of its public education and the level of academic achievement on average for about 50 years, long before Common Core, and it's certainly not because of Common Core. But one can look at many indices, including the huge drop in the 1960s in the SAT scores, and then one can look at commentaries by others, analyses of reading level difficulty in textbooks that were done over the 70s, 80s, and 90s to show that textbooks and reading materials were getting easier. The reading level was becoming lower, to the point today, and I've written a few blogs recently on this, from independent sources, one can judge that the average American high school student is reading at about the 6th or 7th grade level upon graduation. That's not college readiness. And we do not know how Common Core could ever possibly address that issue. It's an issue that has to be addressed in many different ways, but not with the kinds of empty skill sets that are characteristic of Common Core. In any event, the point I'm making is that we needed to raise everybody, all groups. We weren't particularly interested in closing gaps as we were in raising everybody, which is a different direction. And we actually succeeded in raising everybody, and the lower achieving groups actually accelerated more than higher groups did. But they all were moving up because the average was moving up. What you can see if you go to look at the various NAEP tests and even the international tests are the levels of performance, a basic, proficient, advanced, and the one that's below basic that would be not passing at all. And what you want to look at is, are we producing as many higher level students as other countries are? And that's where we fall down. We may have in grade 8 on TIMSS, T-I-M-S-S, the Trends in International Math and Science Survey, we may have an average score that put us in first place tied with Singapore. But when you look at the number of high achieving students, we have a minuscule number compared to the percentage that comes out of Singapore and the other East Asian countries with which our students compete and will be competing. So you have to understand, we all know we have a long way to go because we need more students at the proficient and particularly the advanced level. We certainly need to bring up the bottom, but we also need to bring up the middle and the higher groups because they are certainly outproducing us by high school graduation for the kinds of STEM careers that we would like more American students to be able to enroll in. In any event, that was one piece. A second piece was a focus on the acquisition of content knowledge. Why was this important? Because there is a focus today and a stress on the development of critical thinking. And for those of you who may be familiar with the research literature or the educational literature on critical thinking, there is a very strong school of thinking that you have to know something in order to be able to think critically about it. And so the focus of our standards was as much as possible on the development of a knowledge base about whatever you were going to think about in these different disciplines that were going to be assessed as part of the plan for competency determinations in this state. Excuse me. The third prong of what I did, I mentioned at the very beginning. I wanted to coordinate whatever we were doing with standards, because the standards were going to be embedded in teacher preparation programs, in teacher licensure tests, in professional development criteria, as well as in student assessments, MCAS. Standards have multiple uses, and for some reason we have a national mindset, starting with the USED, that goes back many decades, by the way, that thinks all standards are good for are student tests. Sorry. That is one use, but it's a later use of standards. What you want good standards for is to make sure that you can train your teachers with them through professional development, licensure tests, whatever stage they're in. And that was what we actually successfully did. I have a book coming out next month that will deal with what we did 10 years ago with licensure tests specifically, which is the equivalent of MCAS for students. What do prospective teachers need to know in order to teach the field of their license well? It's a question we need to spend far more time on. And even the reauthorization of ESEA, or No Child Left Behind, that is taking place today, is doing a terrible job in answering that question, which will explain why we have thrown out $50 billion in the past 50 years and will continue to, because we don't deal with the teachers of low-income kids, which need to be looked at as much as the content of the standards and the materials they use. Now, let me get to the validation committee, because time goes by very quickly. And Donna was going to tell me when I have only a few minutes left so I don't run over. But the validation committee was one of the 3 committees set up by the Common Core project. Less than 30 people. I was on it because of the work that I had done here in Massachusetts. Professor Milgram, as you heard from Jamie, was on it to a large extent because the governor of California wanted someone who'd been involved in the development of their first-class math standards on the validation committee. The validation committee was charged with ensuring that whatever standards the standards writers came up with would be 1, internationally benchmarked or comparable, 2, rigorous, 3, research-based. And Jim Milgram and I and 3 others were 5 of the less than 30 people who refused to sign off because we said the standards didn't meet any of those 3 criteria. So we posted our objections. He posted a 13-page criticism that is available for anyone who can understand mathematics. I don't, so I make that very clear. I focused on ELA, he focused on math, and he produced a 13-page criticism going standard by standard, strand by strand, of what the problems were, because he worked as a PhD in mathematics very closely with the math standards writers. This validation committee didn't care. Most of the members were not experts. Jim was the only mathematician on this validation committee. I was the only English language arts standards expert on this validation committee, which should raise the question, who was on this validation committee? And you'd have to look at the descriptions to realize that while they may have been prominent in different areas of education and research, they were not known in the fields of mathematics or English language arts standards. So we had something else going on with the validation committee that to this day, Jim and I have not been able to figure out, because he knows that there was supposed to have been a third pathway to calculus in those standards, and it never emerged. I wouldn't have been able to detect it. He, of course, would be able to tell you what standard should be there that would be in a trig course or in a pre-calculus course that would enable students taking a weak Algebra 2, which is where Common Core ends, what they would have to take in order to be prepared for a calculus course or some advanced math course in their freshman year if they were to be serious contenders for a STEM major in a selective college in this country. So we have this peculiar validation committee that we've written a lot about. Let me move on to the specifics of the flaws, and I'm only going to point to the pages because the details are much too much to go into. Let me just open this up a minute. I just need to make sure. You will see he's got 6 pages of annotation here. I boiled them down to 6 pages. I serve as his editor because I'm trying to get mathematical language into lay terms as much as possible. I can only help you with K through 7. The rest would be for anyone who understands Algebra 1 and up. And let me tell you, that is a challenge in this country because there are very few reporters, boards of education members, media people who understand math standards at all. They usually ask someone like me or some policy wonk in Washington for an opinion, but they cannot evaluate the math standards on their own. So here is from a mathematician what he thinks. And you can go through these to see what the issues are, course by course. Your high school math or science chair would understand these issues because science, as you know, piggybacks on math all the way through, but starting in the more advanced courses in high school. I have a one-pager on what are the problems in English language arts, the flaws. This is self-explanatory. You can see in the middle section what I mean by an empty skill set, which is what I describe Common Core as, and what a true standard is, which is what you had in your old standards. And the problem is that they are different as night is different from day. Even though there may be people, and there are, including the current College Board President, David Coleman, who wrote the ELA standards, who says, oh, Common Core's ELA standards bounced off of Massachusetts. Well, they didn't. They couldn't. He never spoke to me. He refused to speak to me. And he could not tell you how they are like, how they are different, because he doesn't know anything about ELA standards. He wasn't even an English major, and he never taught English. We have a totally different problem with the standards writers themselves. But this will give you at least an introduction to the problems with the English language arts standards in Common Core. This does not mean that you would not find English teachers who would praise whatever they're doing. We always had very good ones in this state. I knew many of them years ago. And they knew, the older ones, certainly what to teach, how to teach, and it didn't matter what the standard said. Unfortunately, in the future, as newer people go into the field and they do not have the strong English majors that older, experienced English teachers had, we will have a completely changing curriculum in the schools. It's already on the way. And all you have to do is ask, what are the major works that are being read? Grades 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's where you really see the preparation for college level reading. If you can find a way to gauge the reading level, which I know how to do because that was part of what I studied in graduate school, you will see that by grades 10, 11, 12, there are very few high school level readings for students going on to college, to do college level reading. We're going to have to face that problem when it comes. College level textbooks can't be dumbed down the way we dumbed high school level textbooks down. College level textbooks are generally written by people at the college level, and they contain big vocabularies. This is the mature field we're talking about. So there are going to be problems with whatever emerges in terms of that college readiness level that will be determined by the grade 11 PARCC test. Remember, this year will be the first year, so we have nothing much to say. Hasn't occurred yet. This is a work in progress. But I have been asking Jeff Nellhouse for years, because I knew him from the time I was in the department. He's in charge of assessments for PARCC. Where do they get the passages from? It's been an argument in the field. 2 more minutes, okay. It's been an argument in the field for 5 years. We don't know where the passages are coming from, or for Smarter Balance, which is being used in New Hampshire. No one knows where the passages are coming from. But in Massachusetts, we did know where the passages were coming from. Our English teachers chose them. That was the difference. You have to find out that when we had control of our own test, which is MCAS, and would still be the possibility, even though MCAS today is based on Common Core standards. I hope I'm not confusing people too much with that, because we've had to change the standards. But the cut score or pass score is still determined by the state. The passages are still being chosen by teachers in the state. And our English teachers knew how to choose demanding passages, because after all, they wanted to be sure that the kids they got the next year could read whatever was on the test that they were putting together. We had first-rate teachers putting together the MCAS test, and all the items, by the way, were released publicly a year after the test was given. That was by statute. So if any of you want to know what kinds of test items were on our MCAS, you go to the department website, and you can still see from 2000, 2001, 2002, the original passages that were used in English language arts, chosen by our English teachers. Now, the last, which I will do very rapidly, we have less than a minute for that one, and that is, what could parents do about this situation? Several things I have suggested, various places. Number one, parents can always opt their students out of testing for PARCC or for any state test. It is not forbidden by state law, despite what the Department of Education may tell you. Parents retain all the rights they have retained for 400 years. So have local school committees, even though they may not think so. So they could opt out of testing, because if less than 95% of a cohort participates in a test, the test results are invalid. Also, parents could ask for fewer tests. What is it that parents can legitimately do who keep their kids in the public schools? I have grandchildren now. My kids are safely through public schools, but I have grandchildren in the schools. Parents can ask for fewer tests. We don't have to have what is now being reauthorized by Congress every year from 3 to 8, a test of every major subject. There's no research base that defends that kind of abusive testing. We learn very little from it. It doesn't relate to learning. So fewer tests, grade span testing, and locally designed report cards. Now you may think that's a very minor, silly thing to mention. I mentioned it only because the latest reauthorization now being fought over in Congress today, and maybe tomorrow, has guidelines from the federal government on what your local report card should look like. And my question to you parents is that a function of the federal government? A report card is a way to have accountability from local schools and teachers to parents. and it should be negotiated at the local level by parents and their local school officials. That was how report cards always were developed. Well, we're now getting a template coming from the federal government about what local report cards should look like. It's extraordinary. I haven't heard anyone comment in the media that this seems to be stepping out of place. So those are things to me that parents can legitimately raise because it's their kids or grandchildren. I'm going to stop here now because I think I've just about used up the time. Thank you very much.
Let me say a few words. First of all, I'm Donna Calorio, founder of Common Core Forum. About a year ago, we were thinking of, I spent 2 years served on the Worcester School Committee, 24 years teaching at Quinn Sigma Community College, union member, and very active in education policy in the last 5 years. And one thing I was getting a lot of questions about Common Core. When I was serving and afterwards, it was just insurmountable. So one of the ideas that was brought to me, and I thought it was really great, was to organize a statewide group, nonpartisan, no funding whatsoever. Bill Gates doesn't give me any money, trust me, all right? The signs I bought with my own money. So if anybody says, well, how did you get those signs? That was my money. So we put together this statewide kind of umbrella group, very loosely formed, full of volunteers. We have, I was just telling Jamie, 2,200 statewide right now, and to educate the public. Now, Sandy comes here, she volunteers her time, Jamie volunteers his time. Sandy's not even feeling that well, and that's why she was sitting down, but I just want you to give another round of applause for our speakers that are still sitting there. One of the things I notice is that I've spoke at different states. I spoke up in Maine, and people traveled to see Jamie and Sandra and a whole panel of people 200 miles to hear them speak. So you're just so fortunate to have both of these experts in our state and willing to come out to your community to educate local communities. So we have had, I want to say 30, maybe 40 of these forums throughout the last year. And one of the things that, another thing, if you didn't get that handout on James Milgram, I know we were a little bit short. If you go to our website, commoncoreforum.org, we have all 3 of those postages downloaded in our, in our information section. Shannon's will know, right? Oh, she'll check, okay. And if anybody wants a sign to put on their lawn to opt out of PARCC, see Shannon afterwards also. Shannon's part of our whole team here. So what our goal is to educate. That's our goal, is to educate parents, and you make the choices because we believe in local control, we believe in parental control, we believe that you have the right to educate your child. So some of the things that we are advocating for 2015, and I'll just go over our list very quickly and then hand the microphone back for questions and answers, is we will be supporting legislation that has been proposed by different legislators at this time. They don't have a bill number yet, but they're all to do with Common Core or PARCC. There's 7 of them right now. And if you look on our website, we also have that listed on our website. We also have a Facebook page that we are very, very active in, Common Core Forum, which we put everything up that's new in the state or maybe even new in the country. We also tweet out too. Not as much, but we do tweet. The other thing we are doing is that we are supporting local towns by putting a non-binding question on their local ballot. So in your town elections in May, I'm not sure what North Reading is doing, but a lot of towns are putting a non-binding question to ask the state legislatures to go back to the pre-2010 Massachusetts standards, which we are, and we're the highest in the country. So we are supporting that legislation to give a message to our state legislators and our new governor and his cabinet member. We are also planning and I think some of you saw I had the handout, but I was kind of low on this handout too. a day on the Hill, which is April 15th. Good day to do it, tax day, right? So when you talk about unfunded mandates like Common Core and PARCC, it's a great day to be up on Beacon Hill to talk to our legislative body. We have a room, and if you need to you can just send me an email and we'll get all the information to you. We're asking for as many people as you can come to the State House, and we're going to have a whole program. Sandy is going to be there. She's going to open up with just a 10-minute talk. We're going to have a couple other experts, and then we're going to go around to the State House and talk to our legislative body. We'll have talking points about Common Core. We'll have handouts. We'll have the bill numbers. And we'll really try to, get our point across. We have just wrapped up 4 forums this month. We have other forums coming up. I have to look at the schedule, and we're here to educate. Just trying to think if there's anything else. Oh, and the last thing, I'm sorry. We will be supporting different school committee candidates throughout the state that will be running on the ballot with our views, and Julie is one of them. Thank you, Julie, for putting your name on the ballot, and we wish you the best of luck here. And as a result of Common Core Forum, we have really lit a fire under a lot of parents, and they have really done tremendously well, and they have taken it to heart to run for a school committee seat, which I commend them at, because it's a lot of work, but there's a lot of great rewards by doing that. So we have parents throughout the state that will be on the ballot in May and in the fall. So these are other things that we have going on. So if you're interested in becoming more involved, or you want to just go on our website or click on like on our Facebook page, feel free to do that. And if you sign up for our email list or whatever, you'll be receiving things that we'll be doing, like our Day on the Hill. We'll be reminding you, we'll tell you what to do, how to get there, and just give you different instructions. So we're very active in the state community. So I will turn the mic over to Lana, and thank you so much, Lana, for having this especially the rescheduling. And it was, it just takes a lot of work to put this on. It may look easy, but to coordinate all efforts, thank you so much, and we are delighted to be in the community.
We're going to move right on to question and answer portion. I hope that you all have questions. You can ask anyone on the panel at all, and let's get started.
Can you confirm that the company Pearson, who owns the PARCC test, also owns the SATs, and what effect that might have on the SAT standards? That was something I'd asked Dr. Daly a few months ago, and I wasn't sure if that was a true statement or not.
Yeah, so Pearson is an enormous testing company in the United States. They also are an enormous textbook manufacturer too. And as far as I know, Sandy can talk a little bit more about it. In Massachusetts, they were responsible for doing the teacher test, but the MCAS test, for example, was done by Measured Progress, which is just over the border in New Hampshire. So that was a local company. But this issue of the influence of private organizations or companies is a great one, because the fact is that whether it's in Louisiana or whether it is in New Mexico, which are both part of the 12 or so states that are in PARCC. A couple of years ago, PARCC had as many as 25 states. It's now lost almost half of its membership. This issue of the influence of the private companies and the testing companies is a big deal, because what it looks like is that because PARCC is a single test, really, it's a single provider, and there's a lot of issues. In fact, these two states have lawsuits around whether PARCC is respectful of state bidding laws, because it basically looks like a giant no-bid contract. I don't think, Sandy may correct me, but I don't think that they are the ones that control the SAT. The SAT and the AP are controlled by the College Board, and David Coleman, as Sandy mentioned, was one of the chief architects of the Common Core, and then a year or two ago, he became head of the College Board. But K-12 education in this country is a $500 billion annual industry. There is a lot of money rolling around here, not just on the Common Core side, but related to everything related to it. And I guess one of the things that I have observed, even though I look like I just got out of high school, I've been doing this for almost 25 years, and I've never seen a circumstance in which private money is having such a profound impact in driving public policy in education. Thankfully, for many, many years, because these decisions were being made at the state level, it was diffused, it was not centralized. But as Common Core and the PARCC test and the Smarter Balanced and the teacher evaluations, as all of this has been driving forward in the last 4 or 5 years, it really is getting back to what it is that Dr. Stotsky said in a Boston Globe op-ed 4 years ago, is that we've gone from no child left behind, which is a federal law, to no vendor left behind. Because the fact is that the adults who are driving Common Core, there are an enormous number of conflicts of interest. I like to say that the conflicts of interest have conflicts of interest. I'll give you just one example of it. So the 3 pieces of analysis that the Massachusetts Commissioner of Education, Mitch Chester, relied upon for the adoption of Common Core in the summer of 2010 were developed by the Massachusetts Business Alliance for Education, the Fordham Institute, and Achieving. Well, Achieving later got the PARCC contract, and what these 3 organizations have in common is that their analysis of the Common Core was paid for by the Gates Foundation. That's the same foundation that paid for the development of the standards. I mean, a fundamental principle of our democracy, going back to the founding here, and frankly going even further back in British legal history, is that no one gets to be judge and jury in their own case. And so I guess that's the thing, whether it's the influence of Pearson or whether it's the influence of of Gates on this, it's deeply, deeply troubling because, as I mentioned in my remarks, the goal of K-12 education is to serve as a civic entity that serves as the wellspring for perpetuating the ideals of our republic. And if the adults that are driving this are either disobeying the law or are engaging in naked financial conflicts of interest in front of the eyes of parents and students, this is like the worst civics lesson possibly imaginable. So I know that's a long way of saying yes. There's a lot of money rolling around here, and Pearson is one of the big players that stands to benefit financially from this.
I would only like to add that in relation to the validation committee, one of the observations I made, because I'm basically an academic researcher by training, it was set up with that name, validation committee, because it was supposed to independently evaluate the quality of the standards that were being developed. Well, who appointed the validation committee? The same people that appointed the standards writers and the original group that developed the college readiness standards. It wasn't an independent group. Now, where was the USED in all of this? The USED could have said, let's bring in some external independent consultants from outside the country and have them give us their judgment about the quality of these standards. It didn't. It let CCSSO itself evaluate itself. So from the very beginning, this was all non-transparent because these were all private organizations. And none of us could ever get any information directly because you couldn't FOIA a private group for information.
This fellow here with the orange.
Yes, I'm Chris Maggott. I'm from Wayland, and I would
Can
like
you
to thank
stand up?
everybody thank you all for coming out. I have 3 kids in the school. I have an 11th grader and I have 2 8th graders. I grew up in an education family. My dad was on the faculty in the School of Education at BU. My mother was a K through 12 teacher. And I've been studying the Common Core situation for over a year and trying to figure out what is going on here, what is really behind it. And I think one of the factors that's giving us all stomach acid is we have a common understanding, which maybe we don't talk about what is the purpose of education. And we have a perception that as our kids are going through the education process, each child should be able to maximize their potential. They're getting as much English literature as they can get. They're getting as much mathematics as they can get. They're getting as much science as they can possibly learn, given their abilities and the amount of work that they put into it. And there's a disconnect that's going on with Common Core. And in Common Core, what's giving us stomach acid is we're seeing ways in which the expectations are being lowered.
Yes.
I have a theory about this, and I think what's going on is the essence of Common Core is rationing. It is rationing education. It is rationing learning. Why is it doing that? Why would we ration instead of pumping every kid as full as we can with knowledge? Why would we do this? And I think I just figured it out. And Jamie, it's in your Wall Street Journal article. 4th paragraph in this is fantastic. This is the missing piece of the puzzle, I think. And it says, Common Core recycles a decades-old top-down approach to education. Its roots are in a letter sent to Hillary Clinton by Mark Tucker, president of the National Center on Education and the Economy after Bill Clinton's presidential victory in 1992. The letter laid out a plan to remold the entire American system into a centralized one run by a system of labor market boards at the local, state, and federal levels where curriculum and job matching will be handled by government functionaries. I think this is the end game. The end game is a system by which you'll have a government entity deciding who is permitted to work, who will we allow to work, not what, a job market that decides who's most qualified for this position over here and what can we pay. No, it'll be a government entity will decide you're allowed to work, you're not allowed to work. And if you're allowed to work, here's where you're allowed to work, and here's what you can be paid. It's a whole different system. There are systems like this. You can find this in Cuba.
It's a European system.
It's
a European system.
Well, it's a Cuban system. It's a.
But I think you're right. One of the things I want to be clear about is that this is not a partisan issue. There's no question about it that as wrote in that piece. I think there's a lot of the players around Common Core have been kicking around Washington D.C. for decades. Some of them are Republicans and some of them are Democrats. As much as Achieve Inc. and the CCSSO and the Governors Association have been advocating for this more workforce development centric model, so is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and so have been people like Jeb Bush. And so while I specifically cite the Mark Tucker letter, which I think is a very revealing, decades-old long letter, the people that are behind this absolutely believe that K-12 education shouldn't be for what I was talking about earlier as being this sort of liberal arts oriented wellspring of citizenship. It definitely is a workforce development model. And they really, I think, earnestly believe that this is not only the way to reform education, and to help the country compete. And it definitely has a kind of more European outlook. One of the best examples that I have as a contrast is that our neighbors to the north, Canada, have a very decentralized system of education. Each province, or the equivalent of our states, controls their own educational destiny. They don't have a national Department of Education. And even though the architects of the U.S. Department of Education put some limits on it, the fact is that these players in Washington, D.C. never really stopped advocating for a growing role. That's what they do. They think they're in D.C., that that's where the action is, and that they're going to fix it. I guess the thing, sort of in summary, that is troubling to me, if you look at Achieve Inc., which runs PARCC, and you look at the Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers and Mark Tucker and left of these other folks, is that while Massachusetts has learned things since 1993, right? We took a different path and learned new things along the way, right? These guys are stuck in like 1991 or 1992. They can't get over the fact that there's actually been states that have boosted their standards and have boosted student achievement, and that there might be a different way to go. And they really just, they keep digging in further and further. And it's also in their self-interest, because the fact is that the more they stay in DC, the more money that's, circulates around it, and it's a self-perpetuating circle. And I do think, it's my opinion, that the fact that they have gotten as far as they have with Common Core and try to push the ball down the field on this sort of workforce development model is itself a commentary about how we hold our public officials of either party accountable. That's really what's at stake here, is that can these trade organizations dictate to parents in states and localities what's going to be taught, what's going to be tested, and how the teachers are going to be evaluated. And I think they're banking on people not doing anything and letting them do it. I think the optimism of the anti-Common Core effort and the work of Don and others, which I think is remarkable, and it's all over the country, is they're saying, no, you can't. You can take our money, but you cannot have our children. And it's because I think that you're exactly right. They want to kind of track kids in different directions. And it's a long answer, but I think you're right. You hit the nail on the head.
We have a question in front here.
So I'm my daughter's refusing the test. She's an 8th grader. If PARCC does go away in Massachusetts, but we still have Common Core, what then?
Then you're stuck. You still have to have a Common Core based test legally. That's the issue, that whatever the state board adopts as standards is still voluntary. That's the nature of standards adopted by a state board. It was even 15 years ago. But the reason why the state board legally adopts a set of standards is because they must serve legally as the basis for a state test, which is something it has the legal authority to require local districts to administer. It does not have the legal authority to require the child to take it. That's not in the statute, and that's pretty clear just about everywhere. But state boards have the authority to require local school districts to administer whatever state test they adopt. So if you get rid of PARCC but still have Common Core standards, you've got to have another Common Core based test, and there are plenty of them out there.
And you're still dumbing down a curriculum.
And it's being dumbed down by about 2 grades. Milgram estimates about 2 to 3 grades worth by the end of high school. By the end of grade 8, because he looks at what is taught in South Asian countries, and that's how he makes his judgment. Most Southeast Asian countries teach a combination of algebra and geometry in grade 7 and 8, so that when students graduate grade 8 and go into their high school grade 9, they're starting advanced math and science courses. We've delayed it so that our kids don't, even under Common Core, completely finish until the end of grade 9, and then there are pieces missing, according to him, so that you end up with a weak Algebra 2 in grade 11 that becomes the basis for this college readiness test, and of course that's the prize. The prize is that if you pass, and we don't know what the pass score is going to be yet because the test hasn't been given, but you are then eligible for credit-bearing courses at the freshman level. Remember, the talk has been about increasing the number of college graduates. That's where, not how much anyone knows, but the percentage of college graduates. And so that was why they were called college readiness standards. We never had them before in this country. And most of the media simply was out to lunch with the name. They didn't understand. The name carried huge significance. All the standards we had before were simply standards for getting to a high school diploma in every state. No one had college readiness standards.
Let me just add one more thing back to your question. So it's the beginning of our awareness as parents to say, no, we had enough. We really have had enough. This is really the tipping point. So we are saying no to PARCC, first of all. So if we don't adopt PARCC, like Sandra said, we still have to have some test that the Department of Ed will administer. But if you have a school committee that votes 5-0 or whatever, majority, and says, we do not want the Common Core.
Okay.
You don't have to do the Common Core.
So
you have
that's
to
the real
administer the
goal.
test. but you don't have to do the Common Core. We still have local control as of today.
So
I mean,
legally,
legally,
I'm from Reading. The
Yes.
Reading School Committee
yeah.
can direct the superintendent to say,
Yes.
no, we're not doing the
Yes.
Common Core.
Yes,
Standards.
standards, not the test, the standards.
Right, go back
Yeah.
to a curriculum
Yeah.
that's better.
Yes,
Or go
before
forward to a curriculum.
pre-2010, the Massachusetts pre-2010, that Sandy was part of,
Actually, you could even argue and let it go to a state Supreme Court for a judgment. But if a school committee says, we're going to adopt X standards, not Common Core, pre-2010 or some other, California's math and science standards, you know, any set of standards other than Common Core, and then directs the school staff to address those standards so that the curriculum addresses something other than Common Core. If the state says, we are empowered to require you to administer the Common Core test, a school committee, in my view, could legally say, we don't want a test that is not based on our legally adopted standards and curriculum. Let's go to the state Supreme Court and fight it out there. I mean, there are just these kinds of possibilities that haven't taken place yet. There are a couple of lawsuits across the country, not of this nature, but there are different states trying to figure out how to get out from under what was a very carefully devised scheme.
we got a lot of questions. We had one over here, the woman in the red. Yes,
Okay.
can you stand up? Yes, yes. Take it, Brett.
Hi, so in Massachusetts, we have a whole lot of folks who are in the education business. 1 in 5 people in the Boston and Cambridge area is a student of some sort, a college student or grad student. And I used to like the Common Core simply because it was folks like Bill Gates and other industry leaders who went to their governors and they said, look, we cannot hire high school graduates because they don't know how to read a manual. They can't figure it out. They can't understand it. One of the reasons the nonfiction was put into place in Common Core was to address that. So my question, I'm so delighted that you're here, Dr. Stotsky, because really this is mostly addressed to you, is the critical thinking components that used to be part of the Massachusetts standards before 2010, would they have addressed that question? Would they have been able to address a nonfiction reading possibility such that the kids who are graduating high school can go into the workforce? In Massachusetts, it's all great to say we're all focused on academics, and trust me, I'm a book lover, I'm a bookseller, I love academics. But the vast majority of the population is not in academia, they're in the business world. And so would the critical thinking components be addressing that?
You've raised a question that's been raised many times before. The problem is that there is no research whatsoever to support the idea that if the English teacher teaches something called informational text, students will be better ready for college or career or critical thinking or whatever. It just doesn't exist. I know the field because my background is in reading research. And I asked all the people I could in cognitive psychology, reading research, I mean, I know most of the people in the field, and I said, can you point me to any research that would support the decision David Coleman made, who, as I said, would not even speak to me, that says that a 50% informational text in the English class is going to make kids college ready. It doesn't exist. This is a lie. It is there for other purposes. And what you have to begin to do, and it sounds terrible to say this over and over again, is every time you hear something that comes from the Gates Foundation or some spokesman, you have to think, what is the opposite of what they're saying? Because that is more likely the truth than whatever they are saying. I have learned that there is a huge act of dissembling taking place to fool people. I mean, this is like Professor Harold Hill from The Music Man, who has sold the entire country on something everybody has bought into, and there's not a stitch of evidence anywhere for any of this.
But what I'm asking is, when you guys designed the standards and then tested the standards, for the critical thinking component, specifically of the ELA standards of, under MCAS and all that, specifically, was not, I know it wasn't designed to do it, but did it effectually allow people to be able to read informational text?
Of course
Well-
it did. Yes, because if you look at the old Massachusetts standards, and I usually bring around a copy with me. Most English teachers traditionally have divided the English curriculum into 4 or 5 parts. High school, I'm talking about. You would have 20% approximately fiction, 20% poetry, 20% dramatic literature, and maybe 20% other kinds of stuff from, say, classical literature, grade 9 and 10 particularly, and then 20% nonfiction, which always, even when I went to school, which was in the 18th century in a small town in Massachusetts, we still read biography, autobiography, a few speeches. I mean, that was all essays. I mean, that was all part of the traditional English curriculum. Now, you have to think about, what did an English teacher do in those days with complex literature? Because nobody has addressed, where does critical thinking come from? And if you speak to English teachers, or if you had a traditional English teacher, you would remember that English teachers would take "to be or not to be," or "my heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky," or whatever it was, seemingly simple line, and you'd spend an hour trying to figure out what that one line meant. That was learning how to read between the lines. That was what well-trained English teachers loved. This was red meat for them. How do you take "the child is father to the man" and try to help kids understand, what does that line mean in that Wordsworth poem? That was learning analytical reading and thinking, because you were going between the lines. You did that with Shakespeare every year. Most kids didn't understand anything about what they were reading until an English teacher got them to learn how to read between the lines and to figure out some of the larger themes that were being played out. But the point is that that was the function of a traditional English curriculum. It isn't what is being presented. Cold reading, close reading that has no relationship to poetry. I know where close reading comes from. If any of you have studied the works of Cleant Brooks and Robert Penn Warren, you know that it was developed to analyze poetry by these two people who became professors of literature at Yale. I mean, people who've been there know this. And David Coleman was there, he knew that. Instead, he's applied close reading to informational text. It doesn't belong there. And history teachers have said, you don't apply decontextualized approaches to a historical document. That's not how you approach a historical document. You look for the context, the purpose of the document, corroborate it, who wrote it, when, where. I mean, those are the things that involve historical analysis. So they've talked about how these skills that are called literacy skills are the opposite of what you want for good history teaching. We're destroying the curriculum in our public schools because most teachers don't understand these things anymore. Neither did David Coleman, Susan Pimentel, or whoever else it was that was making this decision. It's a bunch of charlatans, and I've said this in print, so I don't have any hesitation about saying it.
I want to add a couple of comments on that. So the NAEP test, as Sandy mentioned, it actually tests this 50-50 split between literature and nonfiction. And guess what? Massachusetts has hit the cover off the ball with a 90% approximate commitment to classic literature. So even though the NAEP tests nonfiction, our students still excel. It's also worth noting that, I mean, I work for a free market think tank. I have to say, I've worked around K-12 education for 20 years. My mom prepared teachers for 35 years. My grandmother's a teacher and a principal. I have met very few business people, and I would include, not that I've met him, Bill Gates, that knew anything about the substance of what should be in K-12 education standards. You hear a lot of conversation about workforce development and workforce preparation. The fact is, most of the people around this that are from the business community, whether it's the Chamber of Commerce or other, haven't got the slightest idea. And in truth, I've met only one governor in the last, or observed one governor in the last 30 years that had the slightest idea what might be in there, and that was Bill Weld, who signed the Ed Reform Law. I think in terms of, if you want to look at workforce development, one of the things that is unique and in some respects, the great unsung story, although we have done a lot of research on it, the success of the Ed Reform Law was the regional vocational technical schools in Massachusetts that for many, many years were good at workforce development, developing electricians and plumbers, etc. They have seen about a 40% improvement in their MCAS scores in the last 8 or 9 years, and it's because of the academic focus of the English language arts standards and the math standards under the previous MCAS testing. And I guess finally, really what we have here, because since 2009, we have done several things. Massachusetts killed off the U.S. History MCAS test. MCAS was supposed to ultimately have a U.S. History component to it to join the English, the math, and the science. And in 2009, Commissioner of Education, the same one that decided that we should adopt Common Core, killed off that test. That is where nonfiction primarily belongs, in history. English teachers teach English. They teach literature, poetry, and drama. So really what you have here is between killing off the U.S. History MCAS and you have the adoption of the Common Core. What college readiness looks like over the last 5 or 6 years of policy making looks like this. No history, less literature, poetry, and drama, and a weaker path to math. Now, if that is preparation for college readiness, then this is just lunacy. And I guess finally, the thing that makes us unique, we're not like Oklahoma. No one's going to be doing fracking in Worcester County, right? We don't have lots of natural resources. We don't have oil. We don't have timber to cut. Massachusetts is a state that, for its entire history, going back to being a colony, that has survived on its wits. It's got to be well educated. And to have standards or testing that connects us with Mississippi or Louisiana or Arkansas or dumbs down our standards takes away the biggest competitive advantage that this state has, which is its brains. And if you're talking about workforce development, it neutralizes the thing that is what draws people to this state, which is all the colleges and universities and the hospitals, etc. I mean, people could make an argument whether this is better for Alabama, not a real low-performing state. I would argue that it's not for a variety of different reasons. But it is a bad, bad decision for a place that is known for having really well-educated people.
The woman back there, yeah. Thank you. I have 2 questions. The first is, one of the things that I've noticed over the past 3 years is stress level in children. And I'm talking about elementary school children at this point.
It's gone up or down?
I beg your pardon?
The stress has gone up or down?
Significantly up, to the point of being non-communicative. In Saugus, Massachusetts, last year in the 5th grade, my oldest grandson took the MCAS math exam and got 1 question wrong out of the entire exam. And he has been historically higher than his school performance in terms of his individual performance. On entering, and this was with 1 math class daily, on entering 6th grade, because his middle school was an underperforming school, they decided that children who were top academic students would be having math twice a day. 1 class teaches mathematics. The second class teaches some more mathematics, but also some testing. At the end of the first trimester of school, there was an addition of a 3rd every other day mathematics class on a 2-week rotation. The specific purpose of this class was so that the students themselves could evaluate their performance in mathematics MCAS exams and work out their issues of performance. At no point in time was ever any information transmitted to the families about the fact that these kids can actually opt out of that third math class. So we take a boy who has almost a perfect score, one question away from perfect, and we put him in 3 math classes. When I questioned the superintendent about it, the answer I received from the superintendent was that perhaps he needed some remedial instruction, which of course is really laughable. Now my question to you is, Donna, on your team of people, number one, do you have somebody who assesses the stress level? Is there a psychologist who has written any papers, or either you, Jamie or Dr. Stotsky, either of you, have a psychologist?
Do we have any psychiatrists that are, or psychologists?
Because this plays into harm, okay? Physical and mental harm. This becomes a tort.
The early childhood educators there's a petition by early childhood educators from about 250 to about maybe 500 of them that came out several years ago. If you just Google, you can find it. They have looked into some of the issues of stress. I cannot say there were psychiatrists involved, but these were early childhood psychologists and other
Psychologist is what I'm looking for, yes. Okay, or an attorney.
Psychologist, not a psychiatrist.
Either one.
There's a, I can't remember her name off the top
There's
of
a
my head, but
method
there
to
was
my
we spoke at
madness.
an event out in Megan, was it?
Opchick, something like that.
Megan Kopchak. She's a psychologist in child psychologist in Indiana. If you do a Google search for Common Core, Notre Dame, I think it was a
Notre Dame?
You
spoke there.
Megan
right?
something, Kopchak. She did a video on it. I mean, and that's the only sort of testimony that I've heard about the inappropriateness of some of these standards. But again, I think it speaks to the fact of what Dr. Stotsky said. The people who developed these had really no experience with K-12 education standards before and being in classrooms. And now these are standards that are going to impact 50 million school children. And so to have a disconnect like that between people that write the standards and what goes on in the schools is tremendous. I mean, it's a stark contrast to the efforts that were done here in Massachusetts under Sandy, in which there was tons of input from teachers on the development of the previous standards, which is why they were so good and coherent, is that there was someone, a kind of prime mover behind it who had a lot of experience, but then got a lot of input not only from academics, but teachers, and kind of integrated it all together. The problem
Why can't
is,
we go right back to it? Why can't we just say,
That's the million-dollar
stop,
question.
go back?
You could, but the legislature would have to do it, or the Board of Ed would have to undo its decision, and for face-saving reasons, like 40 other boards of ed, it will not do that. This is a problem all over the country.
but I think, again, I would encourage you to reach out to your legislators, and I'll probably appeal several more times before, we close tonight. Reach out to the governor and the governor's people and to the Secretary of Education, because I think that on the PARCC side of it, and then the Common Core peeling back the standards or trying to undo it, other governors have done executive orders either pulling their state out of the PARCC, and again, half the states that were in a couple years ago have done this, so it can be done. Then you can open the conversation about fighting on the substance of the standards. But this can be done, but you have to reach out to get to your legislators and to the governor and the governor's people, because it can be won, but people have got to make their voices heard. If there's anything that you heard tonight that's problematic, I would encourage you to reach out on it. The other thing that's important to note too is that the new head of the Massachusetts Teachers Association, Barbara Mataloni, is opposed to Common Core and opposed to PARCC, and has become increasingly vocal in it. So again, I want to reiterate, this is not a partisan issue. It's not a conservative or liberal or Democrat or Republican. There's, as people say, if you dislike Common Core, there's something for everyone in this one. And I think we're beginning to see that, in fact, there's no real constituency for Common Core other than the State Department of Ed and a couple of think tanks that have gotten money But there's not a lot of widespread support, and we're seeing this in places like New York and New Jersey and across the country. The polling data is horrendous for the Common Core support among really almost every demographic, and I think that's one of the big advantages we have.
We have like a couple more questions, because in the way back, yes.
Hi, my name is Jeanine. I've been here in North Reading, and I have 4 children, 2 of them that are still in school, 8th grade and 9th grade, and 2 that graduated a long time ago. I've had 30 years with a child in the public school consecutively now, and I've lived the history, the changing of the education. In fact, worked in the admissions department at a local community college back in the early 90s, and was aware of this sort of people coming in with diplomas in hand and couldn't fill out an application. Literacy was a huge issue here in Massachusetts, and I was really pro MCAS, and I was very impressed, Dr. Stotsky, with the standards, and my son who graduated in 2004. When I heard Common Core coming out, I'll be honest with you, I took both of my children out of the public schools in North Reading. These are very high-end schools. I'm heavily invested in them. I'm not wealthy. And I am homeschooling my children. And this is not something that anyone has mentioned here tonight, but community is the core of what it means to be American, what it means to be a citizen of this country. And the schools are the heart of our community. But when somebody brings up something called common, I'll be honest with you, that I might be a little paranoid, but right away I thought they should have come up with a different name, because that just, to me, struck up a sort of a bit of an interest in looking at it. I thought, how can it possibly be a standard that meets 300 million people's needs? It sounds inflexible, and I was very concerned, especially about the literacy standards. I think that looking at themes of justice and love and hate and faith and all these issues that make us human beings is so vital to a child's education and to literacy. In addition, when I heard that Poland had become president of the College Board, I was very disturbed, because college is a huge investment for every one of us, and we want our kids to reach their potential. I heard that mentioned tonight more than one time. And the reality is, if we had an SAT that is the same SAT, we could say, well, that SAT will reveal the flaws in Common Core. But if the SAT has now been rewritten, the GED has now been, how are we testing Common Core? What are we using to say that this is the standard? And when we have the president of every state college and university signing a letter to agree to accept anyone who passes PARCC into college mathematics class without remedial mathematics, how do we know we're competitive? How do we measure it? Is there any way?
It's a great question. I mean, the only external measure is this gold standard TIMSS testing, because they have been very careful about kind of corralling all these different entities into it. And I guess, that is the sort of the key question. I mean, this country was set up to check power. That's what the Constitution does. That's what the state constitutions do. That's what the Bill of Rights do. That's what the Bill of Rights in each state do. And limit and check and control power. And try to hold public officials accountable. That's a fundamental American principle. It's not a Republican or Democratic principle. It's an American principle. And among the long list of concerns that I have about it is that there is really no external measure of its effectiveness, and it's not accountable to anybody. That's the big thing. Is that if the standards are developed and copyrighted by 2 private trade organizations from Washington D.C., and PARCC is owned and run by a private entity from D.C., it really gets to be out of the reach of any one state legislator or any governor or board of ed or commissioner. And so what recourse do taxpayers or legislators or elected officials have to something that is so far out of the reach of public transparency and accountability? It's a very troubling feature of it, not the least of which is that the funding for the PARCC and these testing consortia is baked into stimulus money. So there wasn't, and the Race to the Top was in the stimulus money. There was no bills in Congress about this. There were no hearings in the state legislature. There was no public deliberation, which is a fundamental feature of life in a democracy, is that people get to debate it. And the people that advocate it oftentimes will not debate it. Donna, numerous times, has asked state officials and advocates to debate it. Every once in a while, you can get them to do it, right? But 9 times out of 10, they won't even debate it. And that tells you at its infancy what the implications are and the modes that it functions. You raise really, really important questions. How about this fellow on the far back? Great, sweater, yeah.
One phrase that bothers me quite a bit, and I guess that also bothers me that the business interests seem to be behind it, is the phrase workforce development. Everything that's going on is involving the lowering of the standards, which means that we're shooting for a lower skilled workforce, it almost seems to be. There isn't any room for excelling under Common Core. This is what seems so disturbing to me. Why would our business people be interested in this? Because it sounds like that we're shooting ourselves in the foot. We're bringing society as a whole down. And that's, I guess, I quite oftentimes question what the business people do, but it seems like this is so suicidal almost.
Yeah, you raise a really great point, because the fact of it is that a lot of the advocates for Common Core, whether it's Achieve Inc., who runs PARCC, or the Governor's Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, all these different players, the big buzzword you always hear is global competitiveness, right? The fact is, if you look at the records of Achieve and Governor's Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, the fact is, in the last 25 years, they haven't improved student achievement anywhere. Most of the people that are advocating for it don't know squat about global competitiveness. And the fact is that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, from my point of view, has enough on their own plates. I mean, for decades, we've been running trade deficits with all the industrialized countries in the world, right? So they have enough on their own plates to be manufacturing and developing products that are something that other people want to buy, right? But it gets back to what I said to this woman earlier. They don't know a lot about K-12 education standards, right? And I just would be curious. A guy like Bill Gates obviously does know about global competitiveness. He's one of the wealthiest men in the world, and Microsoft is an internationally respected company. But there is a world of difference between developing microchips for computers and educating a first grader. I mean, this is and the people that he has invested in, or the people that he has, don't have good records. They don't have the expertise that this lady over here does, and that their standards, their work has actually, translated to big gains in student achievement. And so, again, I mean, people in business should expect that the kids that come out of school can write well and read well and analyze and manipulate numbers. That is a fair expectation. But the point of K-12 education is not exclusively workforce development, right? That's not what Thomas Jefferson or John Adams or any of the founding fathers or any of the major political figures really throughout the history of the country ever thought the purpose of it. The purpose of public education and education under our form of government is to develop citizens that are well educated. And it's important for, there's a tangential role here for workforce development, but it is not the primary purpose of K-12 education, and people have kind of confused that, and the politicians confuse that.
I was going to bring up what the lady said. 2 points briefly. Homeschooling is an answer. My parents homeschooled me, and they used a public school curriculum that the Boston school system was not using in the 1950s. And I managed to also get degrees from Harvard in spite of that all. So homeschooling is an answer, and it does need to be addressed, and I think it needs to be addressed in a broader way. Second point briefly is we should not forget that we are countries. Massachusetts, Oregon, and Texas are separate countries of one nation. And when we understand that, then people will be more resistant to the idea of a nation imposing standards on different countries, of which we are all affiliated. The third and other point, which is I think a philosophical point, which I'm curious as to your reaction. When my parents were educating me, they told me that back in the 20s and 30s that people respected a high school diploma in the same way as a college diploma. And I was wondering if there's been any thought to try to bring that back, because right now, whether you get a good high school diploma or a bad one, too often they're similar and they don't have the respect that I know my parents had for that. And I was wondering if that could be brought back a little, and that might help having better standards to be college ready, since high school in fact was a diploma that was well respected.
So I'll mention just a couple of American figures: George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Abraham Lincoln, Herman Melville, Mark Twain, Charles Lindbergh, Thomas Edison. Some of the greatest figures in the history of the country. What do they all share in common? None of them went to college. The uniqueness of this country has always been the high level of literacy that kids have gotten, generally speaking. And it has not been perfect. I am not going to say that it has been always equitable or that we've always done it well. But I think we all know stories of grandparents or parents that didn't have a lot of formal education, that could recite enormous amounts of poetry off the top of their head. They were really well read, whether it was reading newspapers or through religious organizations. And I do think, the evidence is pretty clear that we've been dumbing down K-12 education. The efforts of Dr. Stavsky and others over the last 20 years in Massachusetts is to help correct it and move the ball in a different direction. I just use sort of one anecdotal piece of evidence about how good the previous standards were in Massachusetts. My dad grew up in western Massachusetts and went to Deerfield Academy, which is a pretty good prep school. He went as a day student. He had to go 5 years because that's what day students had to do. When he observed my nephew and the math and the work that he was doing in his English class, which is in a very average school district on Cape Cod, my dad said it was of better quality than what he had at Deerfield Academy, which is a very high quality prep school in the 50s. That is the level of correction that happened under the previous standards. And we had a long way to go in Massachusetts to getting where we really needed to be. We were making great strides, but into kind of remedying this dumbing down. But what we didn't need to do was go back to a world prior to ed reform in which people with not great records were driving policymaking. I don't know if that helped answer your question, but I think that this issue of the loss of value of a high school diploma is been related to the low expectations. And I just think we want to make sure we don't revert back to the lower expectations. Right. And I think the evidence is pretty clear that that's what Common Core will do.
Let me just add to that, because it is pretty clear that there is nothing in Common Core to strengthen the high school diploma. It is designed to get kids into college with the idea that that is the degree that matters, not a high school diploma. In fact, basically it does an end run around the high school diploma, because the college readiness test is in grade 11. And if a student is declared college ready in grade 11, they can apply to college. They don't have to stay in high school to receive a diploma, unless the state law says they can't enter a state university without a high school diploma. But then there are games now being played with the GED that fit into that pattern, encouraging, and this was something someone in Texas discovered. Kids were being encouraged to drop out of high school, take the GED, which is simply a test, and then go to college, minus the 2 years of the high school experience. So there's a whole different outlook on what you need to do to close gaps or achieve social justice, which are some of the buzzwords that are driving some of what is taking place.
Well, I think we're going to wrap it up there. You've all been very patient, and thank you so much for coming. I want to thank our speakers, Jamie Gass, and of course, Donna Colorio. The last thing that I just wanted to say is, please, if you haven't already, please grab some of the handouts over there. They're very, very informative, and also, as Donna said, go on commoncoreforum.org. That is the website, and we also have a Common Core Forum Facebook page. So.
Well, there's a whole darker side to this that we didn't even get What town are you in? Oh, you had one right. Get out here, distance sport. It's great you came out. And you didn't other ones of these?
Flight operating at 12. So they surrounded her with 12-year-olds. The family was stuck there. They'd never gotten beyond there. Within a year, they had her at 16. And schools often become unintended retardation agents based on what the mix is in a particular classroom, particular teacher.
I'd like to check out the
I'll teach them. I mean, I'll have the handouts, I have handouts for the college lobby, I'll have them talk through things. You know, we'll organize all.
That's great. Yep. That's good. That's good. That's good.
I wanted to ask you a question about this. I was talking about it with my son.
Tennis like a... Right.